The photograph had been deceptive in its charm. Standing before the actual structure now, with October wind cutting through her jacket and the smell of wet pine thick in her throat, Maya Reeves understood that some things could never be captured honestly through a camera lens. The lodge rose against the darkening sky like a monument to abandonment, its cedar shingles weathered to the color of old bones, its windows reflecting nothing but the gray wash of approaching storm clouds. 3 stories of 1950s architectural ambition, built when America still believed in the romance of remote places, before convenience became the only currency that mattered. She'd driven 11 hours to reach this place. 11 hours through highways that became state routes that became county roads that finally dissolved into a gravel track barely wide enough for her Honda Civic, branches scraping both sides like fingernails against metal. The real estate agent had called it secluded. The listing had used the word pristine wilderness. Maya would have chosen different words now. Isolated. Forgotten. The kind of place where you could scream and only the trees would hear you. But wasn't that exactly what she'd wanted? Wasn't that precisely why she'd emptied her savings account, signed papers she'd barely read, and bought a property she'd never physically seen before today? If you're already hooked by this mystery, don't forget to like and subscribe. This story is about to get much darker. The city had become impossible. Not just difficult or challenging or any of those softer words people used when they were afraid to admit defeat. Impossible. Every street corner held a memory of Daniel. Every coffee shop, every subway platform, every stupid bench in every stupid park where they'd sat and made plans that would never happen now. 3 years of a relationship, gone in a single afternoon when he'd looked at her across their kitchen table and said the words that still played on loop in her mind during every quiet moment. I don't think I ever really knew you. The keys felt heavy in her palm, their metal cold against her skin. 3 keys on a tarnished brass ring. The real estate agent, a woman named Judith with an unfortunate tendency to end every sentence as if it were a question, had handed them over at the lawyer's office in Millbrook, the nearest town that could claim to have stoplights and a population that crept above 4 digits. The big ones for the front door, the small ones for the bedrooms upstairs. And honestly, sweetie, I have no idea what the 3rd one opens. The previous owner never said. And before that, well, the place has been in probate for almost 15 years. 15 years of emptiness. 15 years of silence accumulating like dust. Maya had asked about the history, about who built it, about why it had sat vacant for so long. Judith had smiled the practiced smile of someone who'd learned that some questions were better deflected than answered. It's got good bones? That's what matters, right? Good bones and a roof that mostly doesn't leak. Mostly. That word was doing a lot of work. Maya climbed the front steps, testing each board before committing her full weight. The porch creaked but held. Leaves had gathered in the corners, creating small dunes of decay. A rocking chair sat near the far end. Its wood gone gray and splintered, and for a moment Maya could almost see someone sitting there. Some echo of a previous life, watching the forest and waiting for something that never came. She shook the image away. It was just the exhaustion talking, the long drive, the stress of the past 6 months catching up with her all at once. The big key slid into the lock with surprising ease. The door opened with a sound like an exhalation, and Maya stepped across the threshold into darkness. The electricity wasn't supposed to be turned on until tomorrow. The propane company wouldn't arrive until Thursday. She'd known this, had prepared for it, had packed a camping lantern and a sleeping bag rated for below freezing temperatures. But standing in the entryway now, with shadows pooling in every corner and the smell of old wood and older secrets filling her lungs, Maya felt the first tremor of real doubt. Not the philosophical kind, not the abstract wondering if she'd made a mistake. This was something more primal, more immediate. The doubt that came from standing in a dark house in the middle of nowhere and realizing that if something went wrong, there was no one to call, no one to hear, no one who even knew exactly where she was. Her phone had lost signal 3 miles back. Maya had watched the bars disappear one by one, had felt a strange mixture of liberation and dread as the last connection to the outside world dissolved. She'd wanted isolation. Congratulations, she told herself. You got it. She clicked on her camping lantern, and the LED glow pushed back the darkness by maybe 10 feet in any direction. The entryway opens into a great room with a cathedral ceiling, exposed beams running overhead like the ribcage of some massive beast. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, big enough to stand in, with a mantel made from a single piece of timber that must have taken 4 men to lift into place. Furniture stood scattered throughout the space, covered in white sheets that had gone gray with time and dust. Ghost furniture for a ghost house. Maya moved deeper inside, her footsteps echoing on hardwood floors that looked hand-laid, each plank carefully fitted to the next. The kitchen was to her left, separated from the great room by a long counter with bar stools lined up like soldiers. Avocado green appliances, chrome fixtures gone dull, linoleum flooring with a pattern that probably seemed modern and exciting in 1957. Everything frozen in time, preserved not out of nostalgia but out of simple neglect. She tried a faucet without much hope and was rewarded with a groan of protest from somewhere deep in the walls, followed by a sputtering cough, and then a stream of rust-brown water that gradually cleared to something approaching transparent. Small victories. The propane might not be on, but at least she had water. Cold water, yes, but water nonetheless. The second floor revealed 4 bedrooms, each with its own peculiar character. One had walls painted a shade of pink that might have been cheerful once but now looked like old flesh. Another featured dark wood paneling and a mounted deer head that watched her with glass eyes full of accusation. The master bedroom, if it could be called that, had a king-sized bed frame but no mattress, and windows on 3 sides that would offer spectacular views once the sun came up. If the sun came up, Maya was beginning to suspect it might be overcast forever in this place. But it was the 3rd floor that stopped her. A single door at the end of the 2nd floor hallway, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, easy to dismiss as a closet or utility access. But the small key on her ring fit the lock, and when Maya opened the door, she found a narrow staircase climbing upward into darkness. The wood here was different, rougher, less finished. These stairs had been added later, she thought. An afterthought, or maybe something more deliberate. The 3rd floor was a single large room, an attic space converted into what might have been an office or a studio. Sloped ceilings, a single round window at the far end like a ship's porthole, and everywhere, covering every surface, pinned to walls and spread across a massive wooden desk, papers, documents, photographs, maps, all of it layered with dust so thick it looked like snow. Maya set her lantern on the desk and lifted one of the photographs. Black and white, the edges soft with age. A group of people standing in front of the lodge, back when the wood was new and the promise of the place still fresh. 10, maybe 12 people. Men in suits despite the wilderness setting. Women in dresses that looked impractical for the forest. Everyone was smiling, but there was something about those smiles that made Maya uneasy. Something too wide, too fixed. The smiles of people who knew they were being photographed and were determined to project a specific image. She set the photo down and picked up another. Same location, different group. More casual this time. People in work clothes, construction gear. Building the lodge, probably. She flipped it over. Written in faded pencil. Foundation crew, June 1954. A map caught her eye next. Hand-drawn, meticulous in its detail. The lodge at the center, trails radiating outward in all directions. But there were markings she didn't understand, symbols that meant nothing to her. XS and circles and strange notations in a cramped hand. And in one corner, drawn with what looked like a different pen in fresher ink, a square with a question mark inside it, and an arrow pointing down. Down where? Maya felt the exhaustion of the day settling into her bones. She needed to eat something, needed to set up her sleeping bag, needed to try to get some rest before tackling everything this place required. But the map bothered her. The arrow bothered her. Down where? She carried the map with her as she descended the stairs, as she explored the main floor one more time with new eyes. Looking for what? A basement entrance? The real estate listing had mentioned a crawl space for utilities, but that was common. Every house had something like that. But this arrow, this symbol, suggested something more. Something intentional. The great room revealed nothing. The kitchen held only the expected door to a pantry. Shelves empty except for a few cans so old their labels had faded to blank paper. Maya moved through each room systematically, running her hands along walls, tapping on floors, listening for hollow sounds, for any indication of space where space shouldn't be. It was almost midnight when she found it. Or rather, when she stopped finding logical explanations for why she hadn't found it. The lodge's footprint was large, probably 3,000 square feet on the main floor. But when Maya paced out the dimensions, when she measured room by room, she kept coming up roughly 400 square feet short. Space that should exist but didn't. Space that the building contained but no room could claim. She stood in what the listing had called the library, though there wasn't a single book present. Just empty built-in shelves and a rolling ladder that led nowhere now. The room felt wrong. Too small for its windows. Too shallow for its length. Maya approached the back wall, the one lined with empty shelves. She pressed her hand against the wood paneling. Solid. Real. But wrong. She began removing shelves, lifting them out of their brackets, setting them aside. The work was methodical, almost meditative. Dust rose in clouds. Her hands were filthy, her clothes smeared with grime. But Maya didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because she knew. The way you sometimes just know things, bypassing logic entirely. She knew there was something behind this wall. The last shelf came away and Maya saw it. A seam in the paneling. Barely visible, designed to blend with the wood grain, but unmistakable once you knew to look for it. She traced it with her fingers. A rectangle roughly door-sized. But there was no handle, no obvious way to open it. The third key. The one Judith had said she didn't know the purpose of. Maya pulled out the key ring, her hands shaking slightly. Not from fear exactly. From something else. Anticipation? Dread? Both merged into a single electric feeling that made her heart pound against her ribs. She searched the seam, running her fingers along every inch, until she found it. A small hole in the wood, nearly invisible. Keyhole. The third key slid in like it had been made for this purpose and this purpose alone. Which, of course, it had been. The click was soft but definitive. The panel swung inward, revealing not a door but darkness. Complete darkness. And stairs. Descending. Maya stood at the threshold, her lantern held high, its light unable to penetrate more than a few steps down. The air that rose from below was different from the rest of the house. Colder. Damper. Carrying a smell that reminded her of caves, of earth, of places that had never seen sunlight. Her rational mind cataloged all the reasons this was a terrible idea. Exploring an unknown space. Alone. In the middle of the night, with no cell service and no one expecting to hear from her. Every horror movie started exactly like this. Every true crime podcast. But Maya was already moving forward. Already descending. Because she'd come here to escape one life, and maybe what she'd really been looking for was another. Something new. Something that belonged entirely to her. A secret no one else knew. A mystery to solve that had nothing to do with failed relationships or urban disappointments or the grinding mundanity of a life that had stopped feeling like living. The stairs were wooden, newer than the lodge's original construction but still decades old. They descended at a steep angle, maybe 15 feet, maybe more. Maya counted 23 steps before her feet touched concrete. A basement. A real basement. Not a crawl space, not a utility area, but an actual room. Rooms. She corrected herself as the lantern light revealed doorways leading to other spaces. A corridor stretching into darkness. The main room was perhaps 20 by 30 feet. The walls were concrete block, painted white once but now showing water stains and age. Metal shelving units lined one wall, most of them empty, but a few still held items. Boxes, canisters, equipment she didn't recognize. In the center of the room sat a table, and on that table, covered in a tarp gone brittle with time, were things that made no immediate sense. Scientific instruments, medical equipment. Maya pulled back the tarp carefully, half expecting it to disintegrate in her hands. Microscopes. 2 of them, old but serious, the kind a researcher would use. Petri dishes, sealed in plastic. Notebooks, their covers molded but the pages inside perhaps still legible. And vials. Dozens of small glass vials, empty now, but each labeled with numbers and dates. The most recent date Maya could make out was October 1959. She picked up one of the notebooks, opened it carefully. The handwriting was precise, scientific. Not a journal or diary, but lab notes, observations, experiments. Words jumped out at her from the yellowed pages. Subject 7 showing increased resistance. Temperature variance producing unexpected results. Containment protocol must be revised. Subject 7. Containment protocol. This wasn't just a basement. This was a laboratory, hidden beneath a remote lodge in the mountains, built in the 1950s, abandoned in 1959, and forgotten for 66 years until Maya turned a key and descended into its secrets. She should leave. Should climb back up those stairs, close the panel, maybe even seal it somehow. Should call someone, though she had no signal and wouldn't even know who to call. The police? And tell them what? That she'd found an old laboratory in the house she'd just bought? That wasn't illegal. Probably wasn't even unusual. Rich people did weird things. History was full of eccentric hobbyists and amateur scientists. But the corridor leading away from the main room called to her. And Maya had never been good at leaving questions unanswered. It was why Daniel had left, probably. Too curious. Too insistent on knowing things. On understanding. On digging until she found the truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable. Even when it destroyed things. She moved down the corridor, her lantern creating a small circle of safety in an ocean of dark. 3 doors, all closed. The first opened into what looked like a storage room. More shelves, more boxes. File cabinets, their metal drawers swollen with humidity. Maya pulled one open. Files. Personnel files, maybe. She saw names, photographs clipped to papers. Faces staring at her from the past. Men mostly. All serious. All with that same 1950s severity of expression. The second door revealed a smaller room, more intimate. A cot in one corner, a small sink, a mirror that had gone spotted with age. Someone had lived down here, or at least spent significant time. Why? What kind of work required you to live in a basement laboratory beneath a remote lodge? The third door was different from the others. Heavier. Metal, not wood. And it was locked. Not with a key lock, but with a bolt, thick and industrial, the kind designed to keep something in rather than to keep someone out. Maya stared at that bolt for a long moment. Every instinct told her to turn around, to leave this place, to climb back upstairs, pack her things, drive back to the city, and pretend she'd never found any of this. Some mysteries demanded to be left alone, but her hand was already moving toward the bolt, already sliding it free. The sound of metal on metal echoed in the confined space, impossibly loud. The door swung open. The room beyond was larger than the others, maybe 15 feet square. And it was empty, completely empty. Just concrete walls and concrete floor and nothing else. Except for the walls. Maya lifted her lantern higher, and in the better light, she saw what she'd almost missed. Words, carved into the concrete. Not written, not painted, but carved, gouged into the surface with something sharp. Desperate. The work of someone who needed to leave a message, who knew no one would ever paint over these words or erase them because no one was supposed to find them at all. Maya moved closer, reading the words that spiraled across the walls and cramped, frantic handwriting carved an inch deep. They said it would help us. They said we were chosen. They said we would be better. We weren't better. We were changed. And change is not always improvement. If you find this, find us. Tell them what happened here. Tell them we were human once. The lantern flickered. The batteries were dying. Maya's hands trembled as she traced the carved letters with her fingers, feeling the desperate energy of whoever had made them, imagining the hours or days it must have taken to gouge these words into solid concrete. The fear, the rage, the hope that someone, someday, would find this message and understand. What had happened here? Who were they? What kind of change were these words describing? And where were the people who had carved this message? Where were the subjects mentioned in those laboratory notes? The lantern flickered again, more insistent this time. Maya backed out of the room, closed the heavy door, slid the bolt back into place with shaking hands. She needed to get back upstairs, needed to process what she'd found, needed to decide what to do next. But as she climbed those 23 stairs, as she emerged back into the library with its empty shelves, as she closed the hidden panel and stood in the quiet darkness of the main floor, Maya understood one fundamental truth. She'd come here looking for escape, for solitude, for a place to rebuild a broken life. Instead, she'd found a mystery that reached back through decades. She'd found questions that demanded answers. She'd found evidence of something that had been deliberately hidden, deliberately forgotten, and she had no idea if uncovering it would save her or destroy her. The lodge creaked around her, settling into the cold October night. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called. The wind picked up, rattling branches against windows. And Maya Reeves, standing in the darkness with filthy hands and a mind racing with impossible questions, made a decision. She wouldn't run from this. She wouldn't seal up that basement and pretend she'd never found it. She would find out what happened here. She would find those people or find out what became of them. She would follow this mystery wherever it led, even if it led somewhere she couldn't return from. Sleep didn't come that first night. Maya lay in her sleeping bag on the hardwood floor of the master bedroom, watching shadows shift across the ceiling as clouds moved past the moon. Every sound the lodge made, and it made many, pulled her back from the edge of unconsciousness. The groan of settling wood, the scratch of branches against siding, the whisper of wind through gaps she'd need to find and seal before winter truly arrived. But it wasn't the sounds of the house that kept her awake. It was the silence beneath them, the silence of that basement, of those rooms, of secrets that had waited 66 years for someone to find them. Her mother used to call it picking at scabs, said it with affection and exasperation in equal measure. Maya, honey, sometimes you just have to let things heal. But Maya had never been able to distinguish between healing and hiding. Daniel had understood that about her at first. It was one of the things he'd said he loved, her intensity, her need to know, to understand, to excavate truth from comfortable lies. They'd met at a documentary screening, some film about corporate malfeasance that had left most of the audience nodding in detached sympathy before heading to wine bars to discuss anything else. But Maya had stayed for the Q&A, had asked questions that made the filmmaker uncomfortable, had wanted to know what happened to the whistleblowers after the cameras stopped rolling. Daniel had approached her afterward, said he'd never seen someone care so much about strangers' stories. 3 years. 3 years of believing she'd found someone who understood her, who wanted the same things, who could handle her need to dig, to question, to never quite accept things as they were presented. And then that afternoon in their kitchen, sunlight slanting through the window in a way that should have been beautiful, Daniel looking at her with something like pity in his eyes. I don't think I ever really knew you. The words had been devastating not because they were cruel, but because they were honest. And beneath the honesty was an accusation Maya couldn't quite deny. That she'd been so busy excavating everyone else, she'd never let him excavate her. That she'd asked him to show her everything while keeping herself carefully curated, controlled, contained. That she'd demanded vulnerability while offering only the appearance of it. Maybe he was right. Maybe that was why she'd driven 11 hours to a place where no one could ask her questions, where no one could dig into her the way she dug into everything else. A place where she could be alone with her own mysteries and avoid the more terrifying prospect of being truly known by another person. Dawn came slowly, reluctantly, as if even the sun was uncertain about this place. Maya dragged herself from the sleeping bag and descended to the kitchen, where she made instant coffee with lukewarm water from the tap and ate a protein bar that tasted like sweetened cardboard. Through the windows, the forest revealed itself in shades of gray and green, pine trees marching up the mountainside in ranks that seemed almost militaristic in their precision. Fog hung in the valleys, making the world feel smaller than it was, more isolated. She should spend the day on practical matters. The propane company was coming tomorrow. She needed to inventory what repairs the lodge required, what systems worked and what didn't. She should drive back to Millbrook, assuming her car would start after yesterday's brutal drive, and stock up on supplies, on food that didn't come in vacuum-sealed pouches, on tools and materials for the work ahead. She should do any of 100 reasonable things. Instead, she found herself standing in the library, staring at the wall of empty shelves, at the panel she'd closed last night. The third key felt warm in her pocket, as if it had absorbed her body heat and held it, waiting. Maya had majored in history at Columbia, despite her father's protests that it was impractical. She'd cared about patterns, about how secrets from decades ago could reach forward and shape lives that hadn't even begun when those secrets were fresh. This basement was history. Those laboratory notes, those carved words, those faces in the personnel files. They were all pieces of a story that had been deliberately erased from the official record. And Maya knew enough about erased stories to know they were usually the ones that mattered most. She opened the panel and descended. In daylight, or what passed for daylight, filtered down through a narrow light well she hadn't noticed in the darkness. The basement looked less sinister and more sad. The concrete walls showed water damage, streaks of rust where moisture had found metal fixtures. The scientific equipment on the table looked less mysterious and more obsolete, the artifacts of a different era's ambitions. But the notebooks were still there, and the vials and the files. And down that corridor, behind that heavy door, those words carved in desperation into solid concrete. Maya started with the notebooks. She'd learned in her research methods classes that documents were like archaeological layers. You had to approach them systematically, cataloging before interpreting, observing before concluding. She photographed each page with her phone, even though she had no signal to upload them anywhere, even though the camera struggled in the dim light. Then she began to read. The handwriting belonged to someone named Dr. Lawrence Hendricks. The early entries, dated from June 1954, were optimistic, almost giddy with possibility. He wrote about breakthrough applications of regenerative therapy and unprecedented healing potential, and subjects demonstrating remarkable adaptation. He referenced someone named Dr. Elena Cross as his partner in the research, mentioned government funding from an agency whose abbreviation Maya didn't recognize, described the lodge as ideally situated for discrete observation periods. Discrete observation periods. That phrase made Maya's skin prickle. Not just observation. Discrete observation. Hidden. Secret. Away from oversight or scrutiny. As the entries progressed through 1954 and into 1955, the tone began to shift. Subtle at first, mentions of unexpected complications and refinement of dosage protocols. But then, more concerning, Subject 3 experiencing motor dysfunction. Subject 7 exhibiting aggressive behavioral changes. Dr. Cross suggests we pause enrollment, but funding requirements demand we continue. Funding requirements. Maya had done enough investigative research to recognize that phrase. It meant someone with money wanted results more than they wanted ethics. Someone who didn't care about complications or side effects or human costs. Someone who'd chosen this remote lodge specifically because it was far from anyone who might ask questions. She flipped ahead, scanning for names, for any identification of these subjects. And there, a list clinical in its brevity. Subject 1, Thomas Brightwell, age 34, coal miner, recruited April 1954. Subject 2, Margaret Chen, age 28, factory worker, recruited April 1954. Subject 3, James Whitlock, age 41, veteran, recruited May 1954. Subject 4, Sarah Kimball, age 23, waitress, recruited May 1954. The list continued through Subject 12, ending with Daniel Orozco, age 19, student, recruited August 1954. 12 people. 12 human beings who'd been brought to this isolated place and subjected to experiments. Recruited, that word was doing a lot of work. Were they volunteers? Were they paid? Did they understand what they were agreeing to? Maya moved to the file cabinets, pulled open drawers with a sense of dread building in her chest. The personnel files were there, and they told a story that made her hands shake as she read. Each subject had been carefully selected, not randomly, not volunteers responding to advertisements. They'd been chosen because they were vulnerable. Thomas Brightwell had black lung disease and was desperate for any treatment that might save him. Margaret Chen was a single mother with medical debt. James Whitlock suffered from war injuries the VA wouldn't cover. Sarah Kimball had a younger sister with cerebral palsy and no money for care. They'd all been offered the same thing: experimental treatment for their conditions or the conditions of people they loved. Free treatment. Cutting-edge therapy that could change their lives. All they had to do was spend 6 months at a remote research facility, allowing doctors to monitor their progress. And they'd be paid. Not much, but enough to matter to people who had nothing. It was predatory, cruel, the kind of medical exploitation that made Maya's stomach turn. These weren't volunteers in any meaningful sense. They were desperate people who'd been given a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Come to the mountains and let us experiment on you, or watch yourself or someone you love suffer and die. And what had happened to them? Maya returned to Dr. Hendrick's notebooks, searching for outcomes, for any indication of what became of these 12 people. The later entries were harder to read, the handwriting more erratic, as if Hendricks had been writing quickly or under stress. Subject 7's aggression cannot be managed with standard protocols. Subject 9 has stopped eating, refuses all interaction. Dr. Cross has left the project, claims ethical violations, and threatens to contact authorities. Then, an entry from September 1959 that made Maya's breath catch. The decision has been made to terminate the program. Subjects will be transferred to a secure facility for ongoing monitoring. All evidence of the research must be removed. I argued against this course, but I was overruled. They say it's for national security. They say the work was too important to be exposed to public scrutiny. They say history will vindicate us. I don't believe them anymore. Transferred. To where? And why had the laboratory been left behind with all these documents, all this evidence? Had Hendricks hidden it, creating a record in case someone someday wanted to know what really happened? Or had the evacuation been so rushed, so panicked, that they'd simply forgotten about the basement, sealed it up and hoped no one would ever find it? Maya climbed the stairs, her mind racing. She needed air, needed space, needed to be somewhere that didn't smell of old concrete and older secrets. She stepped out onto the front porch into cold October morning, and for the first time really looked at the forest surrounding the lodge. Trails. She could see them now, partially overgrown but still visible. The trails from that hand-drawn map she'd found on the 3rd floor. They radiated out from the lodge in multiple directions, disappearing into the trees. Where did they lead? What else was out here? She should call someone. Should report this. But report what exactly? That she'd found evidence of unethical medical experiments from 66 years ago? Experiments that had been run by people who were almost certainly dead now. Subjects who'd been transferred to some unknown facility and might be dead as well, or elderly, or scattered across the country with no memory of this place. And even if she reported it, what would happen? An investigation that went nowhere because too much time had passed? Or worse, an investigation that ended with men in suits telling her this was classified, that she'd signed papers when she bought the lodge that somehow gave them the right to keep her quiet? Maya had covered enough whistleblower stories to know how these things went. The truth didn't always win. Sometimes the truth just got you crushed by people with more power and fewer scruples. But she couldn't do nothing. Couldn't just live here, knowing what had happened beneath her feet, and pretend it didn't matter. Those 12 people mattered. Their stories mattered. What had been done to them mattered. She needed more information. Needed to understand what this regenerative therapy actually was. Needed to find out where those subjects had been transferred. Needed to discover if any of them were still alive, still able to tell their stories. Maya went back inside, grabbed her car keys, and headed for Millbrook. The drive down the mountain was less terrifying in daylight, though no less treacherous. Switchbacks and blind curves, drop-offs that would send a car tumbling hundreds of feet if the driver made even a small mistake. She passed one other vehicle on the 20-mile drive. A pickup truck with a gun rack and a driver who stared at her with undisguised curiosity. New person. Stranger. Someone who didn't belong. Millbrook revealed itself as a town that had seen better days and knew they weren't coming back. Main Street featured more empty storefronts than occupied ones. A hardware store. A diner. A combination post office and general store. A bar called the Timber Room that looked like it had been serving the same crowd for 50 years. And, crucially, a library. The Millbrook Public Library was housed in a brick building that had been someone's mansion once, before the lumber economy collapsed and the wealthy moved away. Inside, it smelled like old books and heating oil. A woman in her 60s looked up from the circulation desk, her expression moving from surprise to pleasure, the look of a librarian who didn't get many visitors and genuinely enjoyed her job. "Can I help you find something?" Her name tag read Patricia. Maya had learned that the best way to get information was to give a little first. "I just bought the old lodge up on Fletcher Ridge. I'm Maya." Patricia's eyebrows rose. "The Hendricks place? Lord, that property been empty since before I was born." "You're either very brave or very foolish, dear." "Why do you say that?" Patricia hesitated, the way people do when they're deciding whether to share local gossip with an outsider. "Just rumors. You know how small towns are. People talk." "What kind of rumors?" "Oh, nothing specific. Just that strange thing happened up there back in the 50s. My mother used to say it was some kind of government thing, real hush-hush. Scientists doing experiments. But you know how people exaggerate. Probably just a rich doctor's vacation home and folks made up stories because they were bored." Maya kept her voice casual. "Do you have any local history archives? Newspapers from that era?" "Sure do. Everything from the Millbrook Gazette going back to 1920. It's all on microfiche in the back room." "You looking for something in particular?" "Just trying to learn about the area, the history of the lodge, if there's anything written about it." Patricia's expression suggested she knew there was more to the story, but she was too polite or too professional to push. "Help yourself. Microfiche machine is old, but it works. You know how to use one?" Maya nodded. She'd spent enough time in university archives to be familiar with the technology. Patricia led her to a small room lined with filing cabinets, each drawer labeled with year ranges. The microfiche machine sat on a table, looking like a relic from a museum of obsolete technology. "Holler if you need anything," Patricia said, and left Maya alone with the past. Maya started with 1954, the year the experiments began. The Millbrook Gazette was a weekly paper, 8 pages of local news, advertisements, and social announcements. She scrolled through months of mundane stories, city council meetings, high school sports, farm reports, until she found it. A small article, barely 2 paragraphs, dated May 15, 1954. Research facility opens on Fletcher Ridge. A medical research facility has opened in the former Brightwood Lodge on Fletcher Ridge. Dr. Lawrence Hendricks and Dr. Elena Cross will be conducting studies in regenerative medicine. The facility will employ several local residents and brings welcomed economic activity to the area. That was it. No mention of subjects. No details about the research. Just a brief notice that positioned the facility as a positive development for the local economy. Maya wondered how many Millbrook residents had worked there. Had they known what was really happening? Or had they been kept as much in the dark as the subjects themselves? She continued through 1954, 1955, 1956. Nothing. No follow-up stories. No articles about breakthrough treatments or medical advances. It was as if the facility had opened and then vanished from public record, operating in silence while the town went about its business. Then, in October 1959, a story that made Maya lean closer to the screen. Facility closes amid rumors of federal investigation. The medical research facility on Fletcher Ridge has closed suddenly. Sources report that federal agents arrived last week and removed equipment and documents. Dr. Lawrence Hendricks could not be reached for comment. Dr. Elena Cross, who left the project in 1957, told the Gazette, "I tried to warn them. I tried to stop it. No one would listen." Maya's hands trembled as she advanced the film. The next week's paper had a follow-up, "Former research doctor found dead." Dr. Elena Cross, 42, was found dead in her home Monday morning. Police are ruling the death a suicide. Dr. Cross had been working as a general practitioner in Millbrook since leaving the Fletcher Ridge facility in 1957. Friends described her as despondent in recent weeks. Suicide, or something made to look like suicide. Maya had researched enough conspiracy theories, and enough actual conspiracies, to know the difference between paranoia and pattern recognition. Dr. Cross had threatened to expose the experiments. She'd spoken to a reporter, however briefly, and then, conveniently, she'd died. Maya printed the articles, feeding quarters into the machine and watching as pages emerged from the ancient printer. She needed proof that she wasn't imagining connections that didn't exist. She searched for any mention of the 12 subjects, typing each name into the library's computer database, searching through years of obituaries and news stories. Nothing. It was as if they'd vanished. 12 people who'd come to Fletcher Ridge and never left a trace in the public record again. By the time Maya left the library, the sun was sinking toward the mountains and her head ached from hours of staring at screens. Patricia waved goodbye with a warmth that suggested she was already planning to tell everyone in town about the strange woman asking questions about the old lodge. Maya stopped at the general store, bought supplies with cash. She'd learned that credit cards left trails, and loaded her car. As she was closing the trunk, a voice behind her made her jump. "You're living up at the Hendricks place." Maya turned to find an elderly man, probably in his 80s, leaning on a cane and studying her with eyes that were sharp despite their age. His flannel jacket had seen better decades, and his boots were the kind that lasted a lifetime because they'd been properly cared for. "I am," Maya said carefully. "Name's Earl Whitlock. My brother Jimmy was up there back in '54. Went up for treatment, they said, for his war injuries. Said they could fix him right up, make him good as new." Earl's expression was hard to read, somewhere between anger and grief and something else. Resignation, maybe, the look of someone who'd carried a weight for too long but had no idea how to put it down. Maya's heart was pounding. James Whitlock? He was one of the subjects. Subjects. That's a polite word for it. Earl spat into the dirt. Guinea pigs are what they were. My brother went up that mountain in the summer of '54, and he never came back down. Not really. They brought him home in the fall of '59, said the treatment hadn't worked, said he needed special care. But he wasn't Jimmy anymore. Couldn't talk right. Couldn't remember things. Shook all the time like he had palsy. My mother took care of him till he died in '67. 33 years old. Whatever they did to him up there, it killed him. Just took 13 years to finish the job. Maya felt tears burning in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. Don't want you're sorry. Want you to be careful. Whatever happened up there, whatever they did, it left a mark on that place. Some marks don't wash off no matter how much time passes. You go digging around, you might not like what you find." "Is that a threat?" Earl laughed, a sound without humor. "Girl, I'm 86 years old and can barely walk. I'm not threatening anybody. I'm warning you, whatever you found up there, and I can see in your eyes you found something, it's bigger than you think. More dangerous than you know. The people who ran that place, they had power. The kind of power that doesn't die just because people do. That kind of power passes on, finds new hands, and it protects itself." He turned and shuffled away before Maya could ask anything else, his cane tapping against the sidewalk in a rhythm that sounded like Morse code for danger, danger, danger. Maya drove back up the mountain in darkness, her headlights cutting tunnels through the forest, Earl Whitlock's words echoing in her mind. This investigation is about to take an even more dangerous turn. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what Maya discovers next. She'd wanted isolation. She'd wanted to escape. She'd wanted a place where she could rebuild herself away from the wreckage of her old life. Instead, she'd found a mystery that reached back through decades, that had destroyed lives, that had killed a doctor who tried to expose it and left a man so damaged he'd taken 13 years to die. She'd found something that maybe should have stayed buried. But Maya had never been good at leaving things buried. It was her fatal flaw, or maybe her defining characteristic. The line between the two had always been blurry. She pulled up to the lodge as the last light bled from the sky and sat in her car for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled, looking at the dark windows and darker secrets contained within. She could leave, could drive back down the mountain, abandon this place, let someone else deal with its ghosts. Could go back to the city, find a studio apartment, get a job that didn't matter, live a small, safe life, and never think about Fletcher Ridge or Dr. Hendricks or the 12 people who'd trusted the wrong promises. But Maya had spent 3 years with someone who'd ultimately decided she was unknowable, who'd looked at her and seen mysteries he couldn't solve, depths he couldn't fathom, and had chosen to walk away rather than keep diving. Maybe he'd been right. Maybe she was unknowable. Maybe she kept herself hidden even from herself. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She couldn't walk away from this. Couldn't let these stories stay buried. Couldn't abandon those 12 people a second time. She got out of the car, gathered her supplies, and walked into the lodge. Tomorrow the propane company would come. Tomorrow she'd have heat and hot water and all the comforts of modern life. Tomorrow she'd start making this place livable. But tonight, she'd go back down into that basement. She'd read every notebook, every file, every scrap of evidence. She'd piece together what had really happened here. And then she'd figure out what to do about it. Because Maya Reeves had spent her whole life digging for truth. And she'd just found the deepest hole she'd ever seen. Now she had to decide if she was brave enough to climb all the way down. The propane company arrived at 9 the next morning. 2 men in coveralls who looked at the lodge with the same mixture of curiosity and unease that seemed to be the default expression of everyone in Millbrook when discussing Fletcher Ridge. They worked efficiently, asking no questions beyond the practical, and by noon Maya had heat and hot water and the small comfort of a functioning stove. After they left, she stood under a shower that ran hot enough to steam the bathroom mirror, washing away days of grime and exhaustion, and tried to organize her thoughts into something resembling a plan. She needed to find the other subjects, or find out what happened to them. Earl Whitlock had given her one piece of the puzzle. His brother had been returned damaged, transformed into something less than he'd been, and had died 13 years later from the slow-motion consequences of whatever had been done to him. But what about the other 11? Had they all been returned? Had any of them survived into the present day? Were any of them still alive, still carrying the secrets of what happened in that basement laboratory? Maya made coffee, real coffee, hot and strong, and spread her findings across the kitchen counter. The photocopied newspaper articles, the photographs she'd taken of the laboratory notebooks, the list of 12 names. She'd learned in her research methodology courses that investigation was about building networks of information, finding connections, following threads until they led somewhere meaningful or frayed into nothing. Every story had multiple entry points. You just had to find the right door to push open. She started with the most recent information, Earl Whitlock's testimony about his brother. James Whitlock had been returned in 1959, had lived until 1967, which meant there should be a death certificate, probably filed in Millbrook or the county seat. Death certificates were public record. They contained information, cause of death, attending physician, place of death. Small details that might point toward larger truths. But Maya had no internet access. No way to search databases or request records digitally. She'd have to go back to Millbrook, back to the county offices, back into the world where people would notice her asking questions and might start asking their own. Before she could second-guess herself, she grabbed her jacket and keys and headed back down the mountain. The Millbrook County Clerk's office occupied a corner of the courthouse, a building that looked like it had been impressive in 1920 and had been slowly declining ever since. The clerk was a woman in her 40s named Denise, who had the exhausted efficiency of someone who'd been doing the same job for too long and knew she'd be doing it for many years more. "I need to request a death certificate," Maya said. "James Whitlock died sometime in 1967. Denise pulled out a form, slid it across the counter with a pen. "Relationship to the deceased? I'm researching the history of a property I just purchased, the Fletcher Ridge Lodge. Mr. Whitlock was connected to the property in the 1950s, and I'm trying to piece together the timeline." It was close enough to the truth to not feel like a complete lie. Denise studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "Fill out the form. There's a $5 fee. Should have it ready by tomorrow afternoon." Tomorrow. Maya had hoped for immediate access, but she knew how these things worked. Bureaucracy moved at its own pace, indifferent to urgency. She filled out the form, paid the fee, and left with a receipt that felt both insignificant and crucial. Back in the car, she sat for a moment, thinking. She had 11 other names. She could request death certificates for all of them, but that would draw attention. Would mark her as someone doing serious research, someone who might be looking for things that were meant to stay hidden. She needed to be strategic. Needed to think about which threads to pull and in what order. Her phone buzzed. She'd parked close enough to the courthouse to catch a signal. A text from her mother. Haven't heard from you in days. Are you okay? Please call. Maya stared at the message, guilt and irritation mixing into a familiar cocktail. She told her mother about buying the lodge, had endured the predictable lecture about impulsive decisions and isolation and how running away from problems never solved them. What she hadn't told her mother was that she wasn't running away. Or maybe she was, but she was also running toward something. Toward a mystery that felt more real, more urgent, more meaningful than anything in her previous life. She typed back, I'm fine, still settling in. We'll call soon. Then she turned off her phone before her mother could respond. The library was her next stop. Patricia looked up from the circulation desk with a smile that suggested she'd been hoping Maya would return. Back so soon? Find what you were looking for yesterday. Some of it, Maya said carefully. I was wondering, do you have any old phone directories? From the 1950s and 60s. Should do. Let me check the archives. Patricia disappeared into the back room and returned with a stack of thin paperback books, their covers water-stained and brittle. Phone directories for Millbrook and surrounding areas, organized by year. Maya took them to a reading table and began searching. Finding someone in the 1950s was simultaneously easier and harder than modern searching. Easier because most households had landlines and most people were listed. Harder because there were no digital shortcuts, no algorithms to narrow results. You had to go page by page, name by name, hoping the person you were looking for had stayed in the area and hadn't moved or married or died or simply vanished. She started with Margaret Chun, subject 2. The 1954 directory listed an M. Chun on Riverside Avenue. Maya copied down the address. By the 1960 directory, the listing was gone. Either Margaret had moved or married and changed her name or died. Maya checked every year through 1970. No Margaret Chun. No M. Chun at that address or any other. She worked through the list systematically, building a spreadsheet in her notebook. Thomas Brightwell, listed in 1953, gone by 1960. Sarah Kimball, listed through 1959, then vanished. Daniel Orozco, no listing at all, which made sense if he'd been a student recruited from elsewhere. One by one, the subjects disappeared from the public record between 1959 and 1960, as if they'd been systematically erased. Except for one. Catherine Mercer, subject 11. Listed at a rural route address through 1965. Then the listing changed, same name, but a different address. An address that included a facility name, Pine Grove Care Center. Maya's pulse quickened. Care facility. Which meant Catherine Mercer might still be alive. Might still be somewhere. Receiving care. Carrying memories of what happened on Fletcher Ridge. Patricia, Maya called across the library. Is there a Pine Grove Care Center around here? Patricia looked up from her computer. Used to be. About 40 miles north, up near Redmond. But it closed back in the 90s, I think. Property sat empty for years. Might be condos now or torn down entirely. Why? Just following a lead. Maya kept her voice light, but her mind was racing. If the facility had closed, where had the residents gone? Were there records? Transfer documents? Any trail that might lead to Catherine Mercer? She spent another hour in the library, searching through old newspapers for any mention of Pine Grove. She found a small article from 1994, Care Facility Closes After Funding Cuts. The article mentioned that residents had been relocated to various facilities throughout the state, but provided no specific details, no list of names, nothing that would help her track anyone. Dead end. Maybe. Or maybe just a door that required a different key. Maya returned to the lodge as afternoon shadows lengthened across the forest. The house felt different now that it had heat, now that she'd been inside its bones and understood some of its secrets. Less hostile, perhaps. Or maybe she was just getting used to the isolation, to the silence, to the weight of history pressing down from all sides. She made dinner. Pasta from a box, sauce from a jar, and ate standing at the kitchen counter, staring out at the darkening trees. Somewhere out there were the trails she'd seen on that hand-drawn map. Tomorrow, she decided she'd explore them, see where they led. The basement had yielded its secrets, or some of them. Maybe the land itself held answers. That night, back in the basement, Maya returned to Dr. Hendrick's notebooks with fresh eyes. She'd read through them quickly before, looking for names and dates and obvious revelations. Now she slowed down, paying attention to the details, to the scientific language, to the descriptions of what the regenerative therapy actually entailed. It was complicated, deliberately obscure, full of terminology that seemed designed to obfuscate rather than illuminate. But certain phrases repeated. Cellular modification, genetic enhancement protocols, accelerated healing response, and one term that appeared again and again, Project Chrysalis. Chrysalis, the transformation of a caterpillar into a butterfly, a metaphor for change, for becoming something new. But butterflies emerged beautifully. These subjects hadn't emerged at all. Or if they had, they'd emerged broken. Maya photographed page after page, creating a digital archive even though she had no way to upload it, no way to share it if something happened to her. The thought sent a chill through her. What if something did happen? What if Earl Whitlock was right, and the power that had created this place still existed, still protected itself? She was alone on this mountain, miles from help, with no one who even knew exactly what she was investigating. She climbed back upstairs and grabbed her laptop. No internet, but she could write, could document everything she'd found, everything she knew, everything she suspected. If something happened to her, maybe someone would find this record. Maybe the truth would survive even if she didn't. She wrote through the night, fingers flying across the keyboard, pouring out the story of the lodge, of the 12 subjects, of Dr. Hendricks and Dr. Cross and the federal agents who'd shut everything down. She wrote about Earl Whitlock's brother, about Catherine Mercer in a care facility that no longer existed, about a conspiracy that had hidden in plain sight for 66 years. She wrote until her eyes burned and her hands cramped, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows and the words on the screen began to blur together. Then she saved the document in 3 places, her laptop, a USB drive, and the cloud, which would sync as soon as she got back within range of cellular signal. Insurance. Evidence. A trail of breadcrumbs for anyone who might come looking. Morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of October day that made you understand why people used to worship the sun. Maya dressed in layers, thermal shirt, fleece, waterproof jacket, and laced up her hiking boots. She filled a backpack with water, energy bars, a first aid kit, and her phone, even though it was useless for communication up here. The camera still worked. That was enough. The first trail started about 50 yards behind the lodge, marked by a cairn of stacked stones nearly hidden in the underbrush. It climbed steadily upward, switchbacking through pine and fir, following what might have been a game trail before humans co-opted it. Maya walked slowly, paying attention to everything, looking for signs of the past, for evidence of what this trail had been used for during the years the facility operated. Half a mile up, she found the first structure. Not a building exactly, more like a platform. Concrete poured in a square maybe 10 feet on each side, with metal fixtures bolted into the corners. The fixtures looked like they might have held something once. A tent? A shelter of some kind? Maya photographed it from multiple angles, trying to imagine what purpose it had served. The trail continued upward. Maya followed it for another mile before finding the second platform, identical to the first. Then a third. 4 platforms total, spaced roughly a mile apart, climbing the mountainside in a pattern that suggested deliberate planning. Observation posts? Storage locations? Something else entirely? At the 4th platform, Maya found something that made her stop. Scratched into the concrete, barely visible beneath decades of lichen and weathering, were initials and a date. TB 1955. Thomas Brightwell, the coal miner with black lung disease. Subject 1. He'd been here, had stood on this platform and carved his mark into the concrete, leaving proof of his existence in a place where someone might someday find it. Maya knelt and traced the letters with her fingers, feeling a connection across time to a man she'd never met, whose life had been derailed by promises that turned out to be lies. What had he been doing up here? What had any of them been doing on these platforms, scattered across the mountainside? She stood and looked around, really looked, trying to see the forest through the eyes of someone in 1955. And that's when she noticed it. The platforms were positioned to have clear lines of sight. Not to each other, but to the lodge. From here, you could see the building clearly, observe the windows, could watch who came and went. They weren't observation posts for watching the forest. They were observation posts for watching the facility. The subjects had been stationed up here, spread across the mountain, monitoring their own prison. But why? What had they been looking for? Or what had been the point of making them watch? Maya hiked back down, her mind churning. The sun was high now, warming the forest, burning off the morning mist. Birds sang in the trees, jays and crows and something else she couldn't identify. Normal forest sounds, peaceful sounds. But underneath them, Maya felt the weight of wrongness, of a place where terrible things had happened and the land itself remembered. Back at the lodge, she made lunch and continued exploring the documents in the basement. The file cabinets yielded more personnel records, including details about the staff who'd worked at the facility. Not just Dr. Hendricks and Dr. Cross, but assistants, technicians, security personnel. One name appeared repeatedly in the security logs. Marcus Thorne, listed as Chief of Security, with notes about containment protocols and subject monitoring. Marcus Thorne. Maya wrote the name in her notebook, circled it. Security chiefs kept records, maintained logs, documented everything because that's what security professionals did. If Marcus Thorne had been thorough, and the meticulous nature of his log entries suggested he had been, there might be more documentation somewhere. Records that had been taken when the facility closed, stored away, forgotten but not destroyed. She climbed to the third floor, to the office space with its layer of papers and photographs. She'd looked through this room quickly before, distracted by the map, by the urgency of finding the basement. Now she approached it methodically, sorting documents into piles, organizing by type and date. Most of it was mundane: supply orders, maintenance schedules, payroll records. But in the bottom drawer of the desk, underneath a stack of blank forms, Maya found a different kind of document. A letter, handwritten, dated October 15th, 1959. The handwriting was shaky, urgent. The pen pressed so hard into the paper it had torn through in places. To whoever finds this, if you're reading these words, then maybe there's still hope. Maybe someone finally came looking. Maybe the truth can still matter. My name is Lawrence Hendricks. I was a doctor once, a researcher. I believed in science, in progress, in the idea that knowledge could save us. I was wrong. Or maybe I was right, but I applied that rightness in the service of wrong things, and now I can't tell the difference anymore. Project Chrysalis was supposed to be a breakthrough. We were studying cellular regeneration, genetic modification, ways to enhance human capability and extend human life. The funding came from a military research division. They wanted soldiers who could heal faster, endure more, fight longer. They dressed it up in language about helping veterans, about medical advances that would benefit everyone. Maybe they even believed it. We started with cells, tissue samples, animal subjects. The results were promising: accelerated healing, increased strength, enhanced sensory capability. The mice we treated could run longer, heal faster, live twice their normal lifespan. Seemed like magic, like we'd found the key to human evolution. But when we moved to human trials, everything changed. The subjects weren't just healing faster. They were changing. Not physically, or not just physically. Their minds were affected. Their personalities. Subject 3 became violent, attacking staff without provocation. Subject 7 stopped speaking, spent hours staring at nothing, as if his consciousness had retreated somewhere we couldn't reach. Subject 9 began to remember things that hadn't happened, or hadn't happened to her. She described events from other subjects' lives as if they were her own memories. Dr. Cross said we should stop. Said we were losing them, that the treatment was destroying the very essence of what made them human. But the funding agency demanded we continue. They said the behavioral changes were acceptable side effects, that we just needed to refine the dosage, perfect the delivery method. They said we were on the verge of something revolutionary. And then Subject 7, James Whitlock, his name was James, he was a good man, a veteran who trusted us, tried to escape. He made it 3 miles down the mountain before security brought him back. And when they did, he was different. More different. As if the exertion, the fear, the desperation had accelerated whatever was happening inside him. He couldn't form words anymore. Couldn't recognize his own face in a mirror. Whatever made him James was gone. And what remained was something else. Something that wore his body but had lost his soul. That's when Dr. Cross left. She told me she was going to expose what we'd done, contact authorities, make sure this never happened to anyone else. I should have helped her, should have stood with her. But I was afraid. Afraid of prison, of losing everything I'd worked for, of admitting that my career, my reputation, my life's work was built on the broken bodies and shattered minds of 12 people who'd trusted me. 3 weeks after Dr. Cross left, she was dead. They said it was suicide. They said she'd been depressed, unstable, that the stress of the work had broken her. But I know the truth. She was murdered, silenced, because the people funding this work couldn't allow the truth to come out. Couldn't let the world know what had been done in the name of progress and national security. I'm writing this on October 15, 1959. Tomorrow, federal agents are coming to close the facility and transfer the subjects to a secure location for ongoing monitoring. I know what that means. It means the subjects will disappear into some black site facility where no one will ever find them, where they'll be studied until they die, and their deaths will be recorded in classified files that no one will read for 50 years. I tried to stop this. I failed. And now all I can do is leave this record, this confession, this plea for forgiveness that I don't deserve and will never receive. If you found this, if you're reading these words, then please, find them. Find the 12 people I destroyed. Find out what happened to them. Tell their families. Tell the world. Don't let their suffering be meaningless. Don't let them be forgotten the way I'm about to forget myself. I'm leaving the lodge tonight. I don't know where I'm going, but I can't stay here, surrounded by ghosts, by the evidence of my crimes. Maybe I'll disappear. Maybe I'll find some way to atone. Maybe I'll do what Dr. Cross did and end things on my own terms. But before I go, I'm hiding in the laboratory, sealing it, leaving all the evidence intact. Because maybe someday someone will care enough to look. Someone will have the courage I lacked. Someone will make this right. My name is Lawrence Hendricks. I was a doctor once. And I'm sorry. God help me. I'm so sorry. LH. Maya's hands were shaking as she set the letter down. This was it. This was the confession, the evidence, the proof that what happened here was criminal, unconscionable, a violation of everything medical ethics stood for. Dr. Hendricks had known, had understood exactly what he'd done. And in the end, overwhelmed by guilt and fear, he'd fled, leaving behind this letter like a message in a bottle, hoping someone would eventually find it and finish what he couldn't. She photographed the letter from multiple angles, making sure every word was captured clearly. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in a plastic bag, preserving it as evidence. This changed everything. With this letter, she had testimony from one of the researchers themselves. Proof that could reopen investigations, force accountability, bring attention to what had been done. But she also had something else. Confirmation that the subjects had been transferred to a secure location. They hadn't just vanished. They'd been taken somewhere. Somewhere classified, somewhere hidden, somewhere the government could continue studying them away from public scrutiny. Finding that location would be nearly impossible. Government facilities didn't advertise their existence, especially not black sites that dealt with classified research. But impossible wasn't the same as unlikely, and Maya had proven good at finding things that were meant to stay hidden. She was climbing down from the 3rd floor, mind racing with possibilities, when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. The crunch of tires on gravel. A vehicle approaching. Maya froze, listening. She hadn't ordered any deliveries. Wasn't expecting any visitors. Up here, miles from anything, unexpected vehicles were rarely good news. She moved to a front window and peered out carefully. A black SUV with tinted windows sat in the driveway, engine running. As she watched, two men got out. Both wore dark suits that looked expensive and out of place in the forest setting. Both had the bearing of professionals, military or law enforcement or private security, that particular combination of alertness and confidence that came from training and experience. One of them looked up at the lodge, and Maya stepped back from the window, heart hammering. They'd seen her, or sensed her. Something. They knew she was here. A knock on the door. Firm, authoritative. Not friendly. Maya considered not answering, but that was foolish. They knew someone was home. Hiding would only make them more suspicious, more aggressive. Better to face this head-on. Find out what they wanted. See if she could deflect their interest without revealing how much she'd discovered. She opened the door, keeping her expression neutral, curious but not alarmed. "Can I help you?" The man in front was in his 50s, with silver hair cut military short and eyes that assessed her with professional detachment. "Ms. Reeves? I'm Agent Hayes with the Department of Defense. This is Agent Morrison. We'd like to ask you a few questions about the property you recently purchased." Department of Defense. Not FBI, not local police, not any civilian agency. The military. Or someone claiming to be military. Maya's mouth went dry, but she kept her voice steady. "Questions about what? May we come in? Do you have a warrant?" Agent Hayes smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This isn't that kind of visit, Ms. Reeves. We're not investigating you. We're just following up on some historical issues related to this property. Issues that may have national security implications." National security. The magic words that justified anything, that shut down questions and opened doors and made constitutional rights disappear like morning fog. Maya wanted to refuse, to tell them to get a warrant or leave, but antagonizing them would only make things worse. And maybe, a small voice whispered in the back of her mind, maybe they'd tell her something useful if she played this carefully. "All right." She stepped back, letting them enter. They moved through the space like professionals, taking in every detail, noting exits and sight lines and potential threats. Morrison, younger, broader, with the build of someone who spent serious time in the gym, stayed near the door while Hayes followed Maya into the great room. "You've been asking questions in town," Hayes said. It wasn't a question. About the facility that operated here in the 1950s. About the research that was conducted. About people who were involved. "I'm curious about the history of my property." "That's not a crime." "No, it's not. But that history touches on classified programs, Ms. Reeves. Programs that are still protected under national security protocols. Which means there are limits to what you can investigate, what you can discuss, and what you can publish." "I haven't published anything." "But you've been documenting, taking photographs, making records, writing reports." Hayes tilted his head slightly. "You're a researcher by training. You know how to build a case, how to compile evidence. We need to make sure you understand the boundaries." They knew. Somehow they knew what she'd been doing. Had they been watching her? Monitoring her visits to the library, her conversations with Earl Whitlock? Or had they been alerted by something else? Maybe the clerk's office? Maybe a flag on death certificate requests? Maybe some tripwire she'd triggered without realizing it? "I'm not trying to cause problems," Maya said carefully. "I'm just trying to understand what happened here." What happened here was a classified research program that ended 66 years ago. The people involved are dead. The work is finished. There's nothing to understand that hasn't already been understood by people with appropriate clearance. People were hurt. 12 people who volunteered for treatment and were experimented on instead. That's not classified research. That's criminal. Hayes' expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Acknowledgement? Approval? Those subjects received compensation. Their families received settlements. The matter was resolved within appropriate legal frameworks. James Whitlock was returned to his family so damaged he couldn't speak. He died 13 years later. That's not compensation. That's not a resolution. Mr. Whitlock's medical issues were tragic but unrelated to the research conducted here. That was determined by an independent medical review. It was a lie, and they both knew it was a lie, but Hayes delivered it with such smooth confidence that Maya understood this was how it worked. How it had always worked. The government did something terrible, classified it for national security, and then anyone who tried to investigate ran into walls of official denials and sealed records and men in suits who spoke in passive voice about independent reviews that never actually happened. "What do you want from me?" Maya asked. "We want you to understand that pursuing this matter further would be counterproductive. For you and for everyone involved. The people you're trying to find, the former subjects, they've been relocated, provided care, and guaranteed anonymity as part of their settlement agreements. Exposing them now, dragging up painful history, would only harm them further. Or it would reveal what was really done to them." "Ms. Reeves." Hayes stepped closer, and Maya had to resist the urge to step back. "You bought this property legally. You have every right to live here. But that right doesn't extend to investigating classified programs or attempting to expose protected information. If you continue down this path, you'll face consequences. Not threats, consequences. Legal consequences. The kind that follow you, that limit your future options, that make the rest of your life more difficult than it needs to be. You're threatening me. I'm informing you. There's a difference." Hayes pulled a business card from his jacket and set it on the table. "If you find anything related to the former facility, documents, equipment, anything that might be government property, call that number. We'll arrange for proper disposal. And Ms. Reeves, it would be wise to focus on renovating your lodge and enjoying your solitude. The past is a dangerous place to spend too much time." He nodded to Morrison, and they both moved toward the door. Maya followed, her mind racing. She should say something, should demand answers, should refuse to be intimidated. But her throat felt tight, her hands clammy. She'd imagined confrontation, but the reality was different. More subtle, more menacing. These men hadn't yelled or threatened violence. They'd simply explained, in calm voices, that she could have her freedom or her investigation, but not both. At the door, Hayes paused. "One more thing. Dr. Hendricks, the researcher who ran this facility, disappeared in 1959. Left no trace. No death certificate, no forwarding address. Just vanished. People who dig too deep into this history have a habit of experiencing similar misfortunes. I'm sure you understand." Then they were gone, the SUV crunching back down the gravel drive, leaving Maya standing in her doorway with her heart pounding and her hands shaking and the absolute certainty that she'd just been warned off by people who had the power to make good on their warnings. She closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. They knew. They'd been watching. They'd come here to scare her into silence. And the terrifying thing was, it had worked. She was scared. She was alone on this mountain with secrets that powerful people wanted to keep buried. And she had no protection, no backup. No one who would even know if she disappeared the way Dr. Hendricks had disappeared. But underneath the fear was something else. Anger. Fury at being told what she could and couldn't investigate, at having her rights and freedoms contingent on staying quiet about crimes committed in the name of national security. Rage at a system that protected perpetrators and punished truth-seekers, that let 12 people be destroyed and then erased them from history as if they'd never mattered at all. Maya pushed off the door and walked to the kitchen table. She picked up Agent Hayes' business card, studied it for a moment, then tore it into small pieces and threw them in the trash. She'd been warned off, threatened with consequences, told to forget what she'd found and move on with her life. And maybe the smart thing would be to listen, to accept that some battles couldn't be won, that some truths were too dangerous to pursue. To renovate the lodge, live her quiet life, let the dead keep their secrets. But Maya Reeves had never been particularly smart about these things. She'd always chosen truth over safety, knowledge over comfort, the hard right over the easy wrong. And she'd be damned if she'd stop now. She had a letter from Dr. Hendricks. She had laboratory records. She had the names of 12 subjects and at least one witness who could testify to what had been done. She had evidence that crimes had been committed and then covered up, hidden behind classification and sealed records and government intimidation. What she didn't have was a way forward. Not yet, but she'd find one, because that's what she did. She found ways forward when everyone else saw only walls. And if it meant consequences, legal, personal, or otherwise, then so be it. Some stories demanded to be told, no matter the cost. This was one of them. Maya spent 2 days inside the lodge, curtains drawn, working by lamplight even during the day. Not hiding exactly. Be careful. There was a difference, she told herself, though the line between caution and fear felt thinner with each passing hour. She'd moved her most important findings to multiple locations. Some in the basement, some hidden in the third-floor office, some sealed in waterproof bags and buried in the forest where only she could find them. Insurance. Redundancy. The habits of someone who understood that evidence could be destroyed and people could be silenced. But evidence could also be copied, distributed, made impossible to fully erase. That's what Maya focused on now. Not just documenting what she'd found, but creating a network of documentation that couldn't be eliminated by a single raid or fire or convenient accident. She'd written everything out longhand in 3 separate notebooks. She'd photographed every document, every page of Dr. Hendrick's journals, every personnel file. She'd transcribed the confession letter word for word. And she'd created a detailed timeline of events from 1954 to 1959, cross-referencing dates from the laboratory notes with the newspaper articles, with the personnel records, with everything she'd found. What emerged was a story more systematic and more horrifying than she'd initially understood. Project Chrysalis hadn't been a rogue experiment or a single doctor's descent into unethical research. It had been planned, funded, overseen by military officials who knew exactly what they were authorizing. The subjects hadn't been randomly selected, they'd been targeted. Chosen specifically because they were desperate, because they had conditions that made them vulnerable to promises of miraculous treatment, because they had no resources or connections that would make authorities listen if they complained. And the treatment itself wasn't just experimental. It was transformative in ways that suggested the military had never intended to simply heal these people. They'd intended to change them, to enhance them, to turn human beings into something else. Stronger, faster, more resilient. Super soldiers, though the term never appeared in the documents. Just euphemisms. Enhanced capability. Optimized performance. Maximized operational potential. But the enhancement had failed, or succeeded in ways that made the subjects unusable for military purposes. They'd become unstable, violent or catatonic or psychologically fragmented. The treatment had rewritten something fundamental in their biology, in their neurology, and the result was people who were neither fully human nor successfully enhanced. Just broken, caught between what they'd been and what they'd been meant to become. Maya sat at the kitchen table on the second night after the agent's visit, staring at her timeline, and felt the full weight of what she'd uncovered. 12 people. 12 lives destroyed by a government program that had classified its crimes as national security. And when the program failed, when the subjects couldn't be turned into weapons, they'd been locked away, hidden, forgotten, while the researchers and military officials involved had continued their careers, moved on to other projects, other experiments, other opportunities to play God with human lives. Her phone buzzed. She'd driven down the mountain that afternoon, parked at the edge of town where she could catch a signal, and uploaded everything to encrypted cloud storage. Now messages were filtering through. Her mother again increasingly worried. A friend from New York asked if she was okay. And one message that made her pause. An email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line simply reading, Fletcher Ridge. Maya opened it with her pulse quickening. Ms. Reeves, I heard you were asking questions about the old facility. My mother was there. She was subject 11. Catherine Mercer. She's still alive. She's 96 years old and in a nursing home in Portland, Oregon. She doesn't talk about what happened, but sometimes she has nightmares. Sometimes she screams names in her sleep. If you want to know the truth, you should talk to her before it's too late. But be careful. People have come looking before. They don't like it when the past won't stay buried. Elizabeth Mercershaw. Maya read the email 3 times, her hands trembling. Catherine Mercer. Still alive. Still carrying the memories of what had been done to her. And her daughter was reaching out, offering access, offering the one thing Maya needed most. A living witness. She typed a response immediately. Ms. Mercershaw, thank you for contacting me. I would very much like to speak with your mother, if she's willing. When would be a good time? I can drive to Portland. Maya. The response came within minutes. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Sunnybrook Care Center on Division Street. Room 314. I'll be there. My mother has good days and bad days. Tomorrow is supposed to be good. But don't wait. We don't know how many good days she has left. Maya looked at the time. It was almost 9 p.m. Portland was at least 10 hours away, maybe more given mountain roads and weather. She'd need to leave by 3 in the morning to make it by 2 p.m. She'd need to prepare questions, gather documents to show Catherine, make sure she had everything she might need to jog the woman's memory, to help her feel safe enough to share what she knew. But more than that, she'd need to be ready for the possibility that she was driving into a trap, that Elizabeth Mercer Shaw wasn't really Catherine's daughter, that this was the government's next move, luring her out into the open where she'd be easier to control, to silence, to make disappear. Maya stared at the email for a long moment, weighing risk against opportunity. Then she made her decision. She'd go, but she'd take precautions. She'd leave copies of everything she'd found with instructions. If she didn't return within 3 days, the documents would be sent to multiple journalists, posted online, delivered to newspapers and television stations. A dead man's switch, insurance against her own disappearance. She spent the next 4 hours preparing, writing instructions, addressing envelopes, creating a package of evidence so complete, so thoroughly documented, that anyone receiving it would understand immediately what had happened at Fletcher Ridge and why it mattered. She sealed everything in a waterproof container and drove down the mountain in darkness, hiding the container in a location she'd scouted days earlier, a hollow in an old-growth cedar tree, marked with a cairn of stones that looked natural but was precisely positioned. Then she went back to the lodge, packed a bag, and at 3 a.m. started the long drive west. The landscape changed as she drove. Mountains gave way to foothills, forests thinned and then thickened again with different trees, Douglas fir and western red cedar replacing the pines of the high country. The weather shifted too, the dry cold of the mountains yielding to the damp chill of the Pacific Northwest, low clouds and mist and rain that fell like negotiation rather than commitment. Maya drove through sunrise, through morning, through the outskirts of Portland where strip malls and suburban sprawl gave way to the city proper. She stopped for coffee and a breakfast sandwich, forcing herself to eat even though anxiety had killed her appetite. She checked her phone compulsively, looking for any sign that this was a setup, any indication that she should turn around and flee. But there was nothing. Just the original email from Elizabeth Mercer Shaw and the confirmation of the meeting time. Sunnybrook Care Center was a modern building trying very hard to not look institutional. Lots of windows, warm colors, landscaping designed to suggest home rather than facility. Maya parked and sat for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She had a recorder in her bag, though she wasn't sure Catherine would agree to be recorded. She had photographs of some of the subjects, including one of a younger Catherine from the personnel files. She had questions written out, organized by priority in case the conversation was cut short. What she didn't have was certainty. About what she'd find, about what Catherine would remember, about whether this meeting would provide answers or just raise more questions. Only one way to find out. The receptionist directed her to the 3rd floor. The elevator ride felt eternal, each floor ticking past with agonizing slowness. Room 314 was halfway down a corridor that smelled of disinfectant and something else. The particular scent of age and care, of lives winding down in rooms that tried very hard to feel like homes but never quite succeeded. Maya knocked softly. A woman's voice called, "Come in." The room was brighter than Maya had expected, sunlight streaming through large windows that looked out over a garden. 2 women sat in chairs near those windows. One was elderly, white-haired and thin, wrapped in a shawl despite the room's warmth. The other was perhaps 60, with Catherine's same bone structure and similar eyes, gray and sharp and assessing. "Ms. Reeves." The younger woman stood. "I'm Elizabeth. This is my mother, Catherine Mercer." Maya stepped forward, suddenly uncertain. Catherine was watching her with an expression that was difficult to read. Not hostile, but not welcoming either. Cautious. The look of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Maya said. Elizabeth said you bought the lodge. Catherine's voice was stronger than Maya expected, clear despite her age. Said you found things. Things that were supposed to stay hidden. I did. I found the laboratory. The records. I found Dr. Hendrick's letter. Something flickered across Catherine's face. Pain? Recognition? Lawrence. He was a good man once. Before the work changed him. Before he understood what he was really doing. Will you tell me what happened? What did they did to you? Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant, focused on something only she could see. When she spoke, her voice had changed, softer, younger somehow, as if she were pulling up memories from so deep they changed her fundamental nature in the telling. I was 25 years old. I had a daughter, Elizabeth's older sister, Sarah. She had leukemia. This was 1954, and leukemia was a death sentence, especially for poor families like ours. We couldn't afford treatment. Couldn't even afford to make her comfortable. I was working 3 jobs, and it still wasn't enough. Elizabeth reached over and took her mother's hand. Catherine squeezed it gently and continued. A man came to our apartment. Said he was from a medical research program. Said they were testing new treatments for blood diseases. Said if I volunteered for their study, they'd treat Sarah for free. Cutting-edge therapy. The best doctors. All I had to do was spend 6 months at their facility, let them monitor my response to a new drug, and Sarah would get everything she needed. So you agreed. What choice did I have? They were offering to save my daughter's life. I would have agreed to anything. Catherine's expression hardened. And they knew that. That's why they chose us. The desperate ones. The ones who'd sign anything, agree to anything, because the alternative was watching someone we loved die. What happened when you got to the lodge? At first, it seemed legitimate. Medical exams. Baseline testing. They drew blood, took measurements, and asked about my health history. Dr. Hendricks and Dr. Cross were professional, kind even. They explained that we'd be receiving an experimental treatment that would enhance our body's natural healing capabilities, make us stronger, healthier. They said it was based on research into cellular regeneration. Catherine paused, her breathing shallow. Elizabeth offered her water, but she waved it away. The treatments started in July. Injections. 3 times a week. They hurt. Not just the needle, the drug itself. It burned going in like fire in your veins. But they said that was normal. Said it meant the treatment was working. And for a while I believed them. I felt stronger, healthier. I could run up the mountain trails without getting winded. Could see better in the dark. Could hear things I'd never noticed before. Conversations happening rooms away. Animals moving through the forest. My own heartbeat like thunder in my ears. Enhanced capabilities, Maya said softly. That's what Hendricks wrote in his notes. Enhanced. Catherine's laugh was bitter. That's a kind word for what they did to us. Because the enhancements came with costs. I started having nightmares. Terrible, vivid dreams where I could feel other people's pain. Hear their thoughts. I'd wake up screaming about things I'd never experienced. Memories that weren't mine. And I wasn't alone. The other subjects were experiencing similar things. Thomas Brightwell, he was subject 1. He became convinced he could talk to trees. Would stand for hours with his hands on bark. Claiming he could feel the sap moving. Could understand what the forest was saying. Dr. Hendricks documented behavioral changes, Maya said. Aggression, psychosis, memory problems. It was worse than that. We weren't just changing behaviorally. We were changing fundamentally. The treatment was rewriting something deep in our biology. I could feel it happening, like my body was becoming something other than human. And the doctors knew. They documented everything. They took notes while we suffered. While we begged them to stop. Catherine's hands were shaking now. Elizabeth moved closer, protective, but Catherine shook her head. No, she needs to hear this. Someone finally needs to hear this. She turned back to Maya, and her eyes were fierce despite her age, despite her frailty. Subject 7, James Whitlock, he tried to escape. Made it 3 miles before they caught him. When they brought him back, they increased his dosage. Said he needed behavioral correction. Within a week, he couldn't speak, couldn't recognize his own face. He just sat in his room, staring at nothing, occasionally making sounds that might have been words once but weren't anymore. What about Dr. Cross? Hendricks wrote that she tried to stop it. Elena was the only one who seemed to care that we were human beings. She argued with Hendricks, with the military officials who visited, said we needed to stop the program, that we were losing the subjects. But she was overruled. The funding was too important. The potential military applications are too valuable. We were acceptable losses in pursuit of strategic advantage. When did she leave? Summer of 1957. She told me she was going to expose what was happening. Said she'd contact authorities. Make sure this never happened to anyone else. I believed her. We all believed her. Catherine's voice broke. Then we heard she'd killed herself. And we understood. We understood that none of us were leaving that mountain alive. That we'd been brought there to be experimented on until we died or became so damaged we couldn't tell anyone what had been done to us. Maya felt tears on her cheeks and wiped them away impatiently. But you survived. You're here. I survived because I learned to hide. To pretend the treatment hadn't affected me as severely as it had the others. I kept my head down, followed orders, showed them what they wanted to see. Someone stable enough to be released, damaged enough to not be a threat. And in 1959, when they shut down the program, they transferred most of the subjects to a military facility in Nevada. But a few of us, the ones they deemed manageable, were sent to civilian care facilities. They paid you lifetime care, medical expenses, a trust fund for my children, in exchange for my silence and a legally binding secrecy agreement. Speaking out meant prison, losing everything, destroying my children's future. Catherine leaned forward, and Maya saw the cost of these memories in every line of her face. So I stayed silent. For 66 years, I stayed silent. I let them seal my records, let them classify my suffering, let them pretend I didn't exist so they could continue their research without accountability. I watched the years pass and wondered how many other programs like Chrysalis existed. How many other desperate people had been lured into laboratories and transformed into experiments. Why tell me now? Why break your silence after all these years? Because I'm dying. Catherine's voice was matter-of-fact. Cancer, probably caused by the treatments, though they'd never admit it. I have maybe 6 months, and I realized I've spent my entire life protecting the people who destroyed me, keeping their secrets, letting them get away with it. And for what? So my children could have comfortable lives? So I could die in a nice facility instead of prison? She reached out and gripped Maya's hand with surprising strength. I'm tired of protecting monsters. I'm tired of prioritizing my comfort over justice. Those 11 other subjects deserve to have their stories told. They deserve for the world to know what was done to them. And the people who authorized it, who funded it, who covered it up, they deserve to be exposed. Even if it's 66 years too late. Even if most of them are dead. Their institutions survive. Their successors continue their work. And maybe if enough light gets shined on the darkness, something might change. Maya pulled out her recorder. Will you tell me everything? On the record? Everything you remember about the program, the subjects, the researchers, the military officials involved? Catherine nodded. Every word, every name, every detail I can remember. And when you leave here, you take this story and you make sure it can't be buried again. You make sure that what happened at Fletcher Ridge becomes part of the historical record. Not classified, not sealed, public, undeniable. For the next 3 hours, Maya recorded Catherine's testimony. Elizabeth sat nearby, hearing for the first time the full story of what her mother had endured. Catherine spoke slowly, carefully, pausing sometimes to collect her thoughts or to push through difficult memories. She described each of the other subjects, their personalities before treatment, the ways they'd changed, what had become of them. She named names, not just Hendricks and Cross, but military officials who'd visited the facility, project managers, security chiefs. She provided dates, details, the kind of specific information that could be corroborated, that could be used to break open sealed records and classified files. When she finished, The sun had moved across the sky and the room had fallen into shadow. Catherine looked exhausted, diminished, as if the telling had cost her some essential energy she'd never recover. But there was also something else in her expression. Relief, release, the particular lightness that comes from finally setting down a burden you've carried too long. "Thank you," Maya said quietly. "I know that wasn't easy. Nothing about this has ever been easy. But at least now it's done. At least now, I can die knowing I told the truth." Catherine squeezed Elizabeth's hand. "Whatever happens next, whatever consequences come from breaking my silence, at least I didn't die protecting the people who hurt me." Elizabeth walked Maya to the door. In the hallway, she turned with tears streaming down her face. "I always knew something had happened to her." She'd wake up screaming. She'd flinch when anyone in a suit approached. She'd refuse to talk about those years, and would change the subject whenever anyone asked. "But I never imagined." "How did you find me?" "Small town networks. Someone in Millbrook mentioned you'd bought the lodge, that you were asking questions. Word travels. And I thought maybe this was the moment. Maybe after all these years, someone finally cared enough to dig. Someone who wouldn't be bought off or scared away." Elizabeth studied Maya carefully. "Can you really do this? Can you expose what happened? Because if you can't, if you're going to give up when things get difficult, then maybe it's better to just let my mother's testimony die with her. At least then she won't have broken her silence for nothing." "I won't give up," Maya said. "I've been threatened, warned off, told that pursuing this will ruin my life. But I'm not stopping. Your mother deserves better. All of them deserve better." Elizabeth pulled her into an unexpected hug. "Then be careful. The people she named, some of them are still alive, still powerful, still connected to the institutions that funded Chrysalis. They've protected this secret for decades. They won't let it go without a fight." Maya drove back toward the mountains as sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like fire, like warning, like the kind of beauty that preceded darkness. She had Catherine's testimony on her recorder. She had names, dates, details that could be verified. She had enough evidence to break the story open, to force investigations, to drag classified programs into public light. But she also had something more. She had the understanding, bone deep and certain, that she'd crossed a point of no return. By recording Catherine's testimony, by collecting evidence, by refusing to be silenced, she'd become a threat, not just to reputations or careers, but to systems of power that had functioned for decades on the principle that some secrets were too important to ever be exposed. Her phone rang as she crossed back into the mountains. Unknown number. Maya considered not answering, but something made her pick up. "Ms. Reeves." Agent Hayes' voice, calm, professional, with an undercurrent of something harder. "I understand you took a trip to Portland today." Maya's blood ran cold. They'd been tracking her, following her, watching her movements. "I didn't realize my travel plans were your concern." "Everything you do is my concern now. You were warned, Ms. Reeves. You were told to let this matter rest. Instead, you drove 10 hours to interview a witness whose testimony is protected under national security classification. Catherine Mercer is 96 years old and dying. She has every right to tell her story. What she has is a legally binding secrecy agreement that supersedes her personal desires. Recording her testimony, planning to distribute that testimony, those are violations of federal law. Serious violations. Then arrest me." There was a pause. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more dangerous. "We don't want to arrest you, Ms. Reeves. We want you to understand the consequences of your actions. Catherine Mercer's care benefits are contingent on her continued compliance with her secrecy agreement. If she violates that agreement, those benefits end. Immediately, she'll be removed from Sunnybrook and placed in a state facility. Her daughter's trust fund will be seized. Everything she's protected for 66 years will be taken away. You'd punish a dying woman for telling the truth? We'd enforce the agreements she signed. That's not punishment. That's the consequences." Maya pulled off the road, hands shaking too hard to drive safely. "What do you want?" "Delete the recording. Destroy any documents you took from Catherine. Forget this conversation happened. And return to your lodge. Continue your renovation. Live your life. Let the past stay in the past where it belongs. And if I don't? Then Catherine Mercer spends her final months in a state facility with minimal care and maximum regret. And you face federal charges for violating the Espionage Act. Your life as you know it ends. Your reputation, your freedom, your future, all gone. For what? For a story about something that happened almost 70 years ago? For people who are mostly dead. For a truth that won't change anything even if you expose it. The line went dead. Maya sat in her car on the side of a mountain road as darkness gathered around her. Staring at her phone, her mind racing. They had all the leverage. They could destroy Catherine's final days. Could prosecute Maya under laws designed to protect national security. Could make both of their lives immeasurably worse if she continued pushing. But they couldn't erase what she'd learned. Couldn't delete the recordings she'd already made. The documents she'd already copied and distributed. Couldn't put the truth back in the box now that she'd let it out. The question was, what did she do next? Publish everything immediately and face the consequences? Hide the evidence and protect Catherine from retaliation? Find some middle path that exposes the truth while minimizing the harm to innocent people. Maya started her car and continued driving into the mountains, toward the lodge, toward the secrets that had started all of this. She didn't have answers yet. But she had something more important. She had the truth. Complete, documented, verified by a living witness. What she did with that truth, how she protected it, how she released it, how she balanced justice against harm. That was the question she'd spend the long mountain night wrestling with. Because some decisions couldn't be made in a moment. Some choices required darkness and silence and the kind of deep thinking that only came when you were truly, completely alone. And Maya had never been more alone. Or more certain that what happened next would define not just her life, but the legacy of 12 people who'd been erased from history. It was time to decide what kind of person she wanted to be. The kind who stayed silent to protect herself and others from consequences. Or the kind who spoke truth regardless of cost. The mountain offered no guidance. The forest held no answers. Only Maya could decide what came next. Maya didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with Catherine's recorded testimony playing through her headphones, listening to the old woman's voice describe horrors that had been buried for decades, and she thought about power. Not the abstract kind discussed in philosophy classes, but the concrete, practical power to destroy lives and then classify that destruction as necessary for national security. The power to decide which truths mattered and which could be erased. The power to make people like Catherine Mercer sign away their own stories in exchange for basic survival. Outside, the October wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant ocean waves. Inside, Maya's laptop glowed in the darkness, cursor blinking in a blank document, waiting for her to decide what words to write, what story to tell, what kind of reporter, what kind of person she was going to be. Maybe she'd never let Daniel see the parts of herself that mattered most. The parts that chose truth over comfort, that couldn't walk away from injustice even when it was the smart, safe choice. But she'd burned that life down herself. Had bought this lodge, had come to this mountain, had opened doors that were meant to stay closed. And now she had to decide if she'd done all of that just to run away from Daniel's accusation, or if she'd done it to finally become the person she'd always claimed to be. By dawn, Maya had made her decision. Not the easy one, not the safe one, but the only one she could live with. She spent the morning preparing. She'd learned in her years of investigative work that exposing powerful secrets required more than just evidence. It required strategy, timing, multiple simultaneous pressure points that made suppression impossible. You couldn't just publish a story and hope the truth would speak for itself. You had to make the truth unavoidable, undeniable, too widely distributed to be contained. Maya created a comprehensive package. Catherine's recorded testimony, transcribed and annotated. Dr. Hendrick's confession letter. Excerpts from the laboratory notebooks with their clinical descriptions of human suffering. The personnel files showing how subjects had been selected for their vulnerability. The newspaper articles documenting the facility's closure and Dr. Cross's suspicious death. and her own investigative report, tying everything together into a narrative that was clear, compelling, and thoroughly sourced. Then she made copies, digital and physical. She uploaded encrypted files to multiple cloud services. She burned DVDs and sealed them in envelopes addressed to journalists she'd researched, reporters who'd covered government malfeasance, who'd shown they couldn't be intimidated, who had the institutional backing to weather the legal challenges that would inevitably come. She prepared a package for the ACLU, another for an organization that specialized in military accountability, a third for an academic research center that studied medical ethics violations. But most importantly, she prepared a package for Elizabeth Mercer Shaw. Everything Catherine had shared, everything Maya had found, compiled into a record that would survive regardless of what happened next. Insurance for Catherine's testimony. Proof that her mother's courage hadn't been for nothing. By noon, Maya was ready. She loaded everything into her car and drove down the mountain one more time, possibly the last time, depending on how the next few days unfolded. In Millbrook, she went to the post office and mailed her packages with tracking numbers and delivery confirmation. Multiple envelopes going to multiple destinations, creating a network of evidence that couldn't be intercepted or suppressed in one coordinated action. Then she drove to the library. Patricia looked up with her usual warm smile, though it dimmed slightly when she saw Maya's expression. "You look like someone who's about to do something either very brave or very foolish," Patricia said. "Probably both." Maya approached the desk. "I need to use a computer with internet access. And I need you to witness something." "Witness what?" "The publication of a story. I need someone who can testify that I posted it myself, that it wasn't hacked or fabricated or uploaded by someone else. I need a local witness with credibility." Patricia studied her for a long moment. "This is about the lodge. About what happened up there in the 50s. "Yes. You're going to expose it. Even though people have told you not to. Even though there will be consequences." "Yes." Patricia was quiet, and Maya wondered if she'd refuse. If the request was too much, too dangerous, too likely to splash back on a small-town librarian who'd never asked to be involved in government conspiracies and classified programs. But then Patricia nodded slowly. "Computer 3. I'll bring my phone. If we're documenting this, we're documenting it properly." Maya logged into her blog, a platform she'd maintained for years, posting investigative pieces and analysis, followed by enough journalists and activists that anything she published would be noticed immediately. She uploaded her comprehensive report, all 20,000 words of it, including embedded audio clips from Catherine's testimony and scanned images of the key documents. She wrote a headline that was clear and unambiguous: Project Chrysalis. How the U.S. military experimented on 12 Americans in a secret facility, then covered it up for 66 years. Her finger hovered over the publish button. Once she pressed it, there was no taking it back. The story would be live, would be cached by search engines, would be downloaded and shared and archived beyond any possibility of complete deletion. She'd be violating the warnings she'd received, would be exposing classified information, would be making herself a target for prosecution, harassment, possibly worse. But 12 people had suffered in that laboratory. 12 people had been lured with false promises, experimented on, destroyed, and then erased from history. One of them was still alive, dying in a care facility, having spent 66 years protecting the people who'd hurt her. Maya thought about James Whitlock, returned to his family so damaged he couldn't speak. About Dr. Elena Cross, murdered and made to look like suicide. About Thomas Brightwell carving his initials into concrete on a mountainside, leaving proof that he'd existed, that he'd mattered. About Catherine Mercer's voice on the recording, steady despite her age, despite her fear, saying, "I'm tired of protecting monsters." Maya pressed publish. The page refreshed. The story went live. Patricia, standing beside her with her phone raised, recorded the timestamp, the screen. Maya's face as she sat back and exhaled a breath she felt like she'd been holding for weeks. "It's done," Maya said quietly. "Yes," Patricia agreed. "It is. And now the hard part begins." Within an hour, the story was being shared. Within 2 hours, it had been picked up by 3 major news outlets. Within 4 hours, Maya's phone, which she'd turned back on deliberately, wanting to be reachable, wanting to face whatever came next, was ringing constantly. Journalists requesting interviews, producers wanting her to appear on their shows, legal threats from government attorneys, and one call from Agent Hayes that Maya declined, then blocked. But there was also another kind of response. People thanking her, sharing their own stories of government experimentation, of military programs that had harmed civilians, of classified secrets that had destroyed lives. Historians offering context, medical ethicists providing analysis, veterans groups expressing outrage. A groundswell of attention that made the story impossible to ignore or suppress. By evening, Maya was back at the lodge, watching the story spread across the internet like a controlled burn, consuming old lies and exposing truths that had been buried too long. Her laptop screen showed news sites updating their coverage, social media amplifying the revelations, calls for congressional investigations and declassification of records related to Project Chrysalis. Her phone rang. Elizabeth Mercershaw. "She's seen it," Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion. "My mother. I showed her the coverage, the responses, the way people are reacting. She's been crying for an hour. Happy tears," she says. "Relieved tears. She keeps saying they can't hide it now. They can't make us disappear again. How is she? Have there been any threats about her care?" "Not yet. I think they're too busy trying to contain the fallout to worry about retribution. And honestly, with this much attention, with this many people watching, I don't think they can touch her now. Any action against her would just confirm everything you published." Maya felt some of the tension she'd been carrying begin to ease. "Good. That's good. Tell her. Tell her she was brave. Tell her that her testimony is going to change things. Tell her she saved lives. Even if we never know whose lives or how. I will. And Maya, thank you for not backing down, for choosing the hard right over the easy wrong, for giving my mother the thing she needed most, validation that what happened to her mattered, that she mattered." After Elizabeth hung up, Maya stood on the front porch and looked out at the darkening forest. The trails were out there, winding through the trees toward those platforms where subjects had been stationed to watch their own prison. The basement was below her feet with its laboratory and carved warnings and evidence of systematic cruelty. The third-floor office held Dr. Hendrick's confession, his final plea for forgiveness that would never come. This lodge was a monument to crimes committed in the name of progress and national security. But maybe it could be something else too. Maybe it could be a place of remembrance. A testament to the 12 people who'd suffered here and the one woman who'd survived to tell their story. Over the next days and weeks, the fallout continued. Congressional hearings were announced. The Department of Defense released a statement acknowledging that Project Chrysalis had existed and apologizing for ethical lapses, while insisting that such programs were inconsistent with current standards and practices. Lawyers filed lawsuits on behalf of subjects' families, demanding compensation and full disclosure of records. Medical journals published analyses of what the experimental treatment might have been, what it might have done, what long-term effects the survivors might still be experiencing. Maya, at the center of it all, did interview after interview, appeared on news programs and podcasts, spoke at conferences and universities. She became, temporarily, the face of this story, the person who'd refused to stay silent, who'd chosen exposure over safety. But she also faced consequences. She was named in multiple lawsuits filed by the government, charged with violating the Espionage Act, threatened with prosecution. Her financial accounts were frozen pending investigation. She received death threats from people who believed she was a traitor, who thought some secrets should stay buried, who preferred the comfortable lie of government benevolence to the uncomfortable truth of government malfeasance. And yet, she didn't regret it. Not when she received a letter from one of Thomas Brightwell's grandchildren, thanking her for giving their family closure, for proving that the story their grandfather had whispered about in his final years wasn't delusion or paranoia but truth. Not when she got a call from Earl Whitlock, his old voice cracking with emotion, saying, "Jimmy can rest now. My brother can finally rest." Not when Catherine Mercer died, peacefully, for months after giving her testimony, with her daughter holding her hand and the knowledge that her silence had finally been broken. The legal battles took longer. Maya's case became a cause célèbre, attracting pro bono attorneys from organizations specializing in First Amendment defense. The charges against her were eventually dropped, not because the government decided she'd done nothing wrong, but because prosecuting her would have required revealing more classified information, would have given her platform to expose additional secrets, would have made her a martyr and the story impossible to contain. It was a victory of sorts. She was free, broke, her savings depleted by legal fees despite the pro bono help, but free. And the story she'd exposed had taken on a life of its own, had spawned investigations into other military programs, had led to policy changes and new oversight mechanisms. Small changes, incremental progress, but progress nonetheless. Maya returned to Fletcher Ridge on a cold day in March 6 months after she'd first arrived. The lodge looked the same. Weathered wood, empty windows, that sense of isolation that had first drawn her here. But it felt different now. Less haunted. Less heavy with secrets. The truth had been told. The ghosts had been acknowledged. And while that didn't erase what had happened, didn't undo the suffering or bring back the destroyed lives, it meant something. It meant the crimes had been named. The victims had been remembered. The perpetrators had been exposed, even if most of them were dead and beyond earthly justice. She spent the spring renovating, not trying to erase the lodge's history, but incorporating it. She turned the third-floor office into an archive. All the documents she'd found, properly preserved, available for researchers who wanted to study this chapter of American history. She left the basement laboratory intact, sealed behind a locked door but preserved as evidence, as memorial, as reminder. She created a website documenting everything she'd learned, everything Catherine had shared, with photos and recordings and primary sources. The lodge became, gradually, something between a home and a museum. A place where Maya lived, but also a place that bore witness to what had happened within its walls. She gave occasional tours to journalists, to students, to family members of the subjects who wanted to see where their relatives had suffered. She answered emails from researchers, from filmmakers, from people writing books about government experimentation and medical ethics violations. And slowly, she built a new life. Not the life she'd had in New York, with its career trajectory and relationship milestones and conventional markers of success. Something smaller, quieter, but also more meaningful. She wrote, published articles about government accountability, about the importance of questioning authority, about the ordinary people who'd been harmed by programs they'd never consented to. She testified before congressional committees. She spoke at universities. She became, in ways she'd never anticipated, a voice for transparency, for the principle that some truths were too important to be classified forever. Daniel reached out 8 months after she'd published the Chrysalis story. He'd seen her on the news, had read her articles, had followed the legal battles from a distance. He sent a long email, apologizing for his final words to her, acknowledging that he'd been wrong, that she'd been exactly who she'd always claimed to be. Someone who cared about truth more than comfort, who couldn't walk away from injustice even when walking away was rational and safe and sensible. He said he understood now why she'd been so guarded, why she'd never fully let him in, because the parts of herself she'd protected weren't weaknesses or flaws. They were her core, her purpose, the thing that made her who she was. Maya read his email 3 times, feeling complicated emotions she couldn't quite name. Vindication, maybe, sadness for what they'd lost, but also acceptance. They'd been wrong for each other, ultimately, not because either of them was bad or broken, but because they'd needed different things. He'd needed someone who could be fully present in their shared life. She'd needed someone who could understand that her life would always involve chasing truths that others wanted buried. She wrote back, thanking him for the apology but not suggesting they reconnect. Some relationships ended for good reasons. Some doors, once closed, were meant to stay that way. By summer, the lodge felt less like a place she'd fled to and more like a place she'd chosen. The forest was beautiful when you learned to see it. Not as isolation but as solitude, not as emptiness but as space. She hiked the trails regularly, visited those platforms where subjects had once stood watching their own imprisonment, left small cairns of stones as markers, as memorials, as acknowledgement. She thought often about Catherine Mercer. about the courage it had taken to break 66 years of silence, about the choice Catherine had made, at the very end of her life, to prioritize truth over comfort, justice over security, the needs of people she'd never meet over her own protected status. It was the kind of choice Maya had faced too, in her own way, the kind of choice that defined character, that revealed what you really valued when the easy path and the right path diverged. On the anniversary of publishing the Chrysalis story, Maya stood on the lodge's front porch and looked out at the mountains. She'd come here running from failure, from heartbreak, from a life that had stopped making sense. She'd found something else instead. A mystery that became a mission, a story that needed telling, a purpose that gave her broken life new meaning. The 12 subjects of Project Chrysalis are dead now, all of them. Catherine had been the last, had survived long enough to tell their story, to make sure they weren't forgotten. But their names were part of the historical record now. Their suffering had been acknowledged. The crimes committed against them had been exposed and, in some small way, addressed. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something. It was what Maya had been able to do, what she'd chosen to do, despite the costs, despite the consequences, despite the easier option of staying silent. She went inside and made coffee, settled at her desk, opened her laptop. She had a new story to investigate, whispers of another program, another facility, another set of vulnerable people who'd been promised healing and given something else entirely. If this story moved you, please share it with others and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Stories like these need to be told. The work was never finished. The powerful would always abuse the powerless if no one was watching, if no one was willing to expose their crimes, if no one cared enough to dig through classified files and buried records and decades of official denial. But Maya cared. It was her fatal flaw and her defining strength. The thing that had cost her relationships and careers and the comfortable life she might have built. The thing that had brought her to this mountain, to this lodge, to this purpose she'd never anticipated but now couldn't imagine abandoning. She began to write. The words came easily now, flowing from her fingers onto the screen, building an argument, constructing a narrative, telling a story that powerful people didn't want told. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Inside, Maya did the only thing she'd ever really known how to do. She told the truth. And she didn't stop. Because some people spent their lives building walls. Some people spent their lives tearing them down. Maya had finally figured out which kind of person she was. Had finally become, fully and completely, the person she'd always been meant to be. The kind who couldn't look away. The kind who chose truth over silence, justice over comfort, the hard right over the easy wrong. The kind who knew that changing the world required starting with one story, one truth, one act of courage that inspired others to be brave too. She'd found that courage in Catherine Mercer, in Dr. Elena Cross, in Thomas Brightwell's initials carved into concrete on a mountainside, in 12 people who'd suffered and been forgotten but whose stories had finally, after 66 years, been told. And now Maya would find that courage again in the next story, and the next and the next, because that's what you did when you understood that truth mattered more than comfort. You kept digging, you kept exposing, you kept fighting, even when, especially when, the powerful told you to stop. The cursor blinked. Maya smiled and began to type. The work continued. The truth demanded it, and she would not be silent. Maya spends a sleepless night listening to Catherine Mercer's recorded testimony, confronting the reality of institutional power, the kind that destroys lives and then classifies that destruction as necessary for national security. Sitting in the darkness with her laptop's cursor blinking in a blank document, she faces a defining choice about what kind of reporter and what kind of person she will be. She reflects on Daniel's accusation that he never really knew her, realizing he might have been right. She'd never shown him the parts of herself that mattered most, the parts that chose truth over comfort, that couldn't walk away from injustice even when it was the smart, safe choice. By dawn, Maya makes her decision. Not the easy one, not the safe one, but the only one she can live with. Drawing on her investigative experience, Maya understands that exposing powerful secrets requires more than evidence. It requires strategy, timing, and multiple pressure points that make suppression impossible. She creates a comprehensive package containing Catherine's testimony, Dr. Hendrick's confession letter, laboratory notebook excerpts, personnel files, newspaper articles about the facility's closure and Dr. Cross's suspicious death, and her own investigative report tying everything together. Maya makes multiple copies, both digital and physical. She uploads encrypted files to cloud services, burns DVDs, and prepares packages for journalists who've covered government malfeasance, the ACLU, organization specializing in military accountability, and academic research centers studying medical ethics violations. Most importantly, she prepares a package for Elizabeth Mercer-Shaw, insurance that Catherine's testimony will survive regardless of what happens next. Daniel reached out 8 months after she'd published the Chrysalis story. He'd seen her on the news, had read her articles, had followed the legal battles from a distance. He sent a long email, apologizing for his final words to her, acknowledging that he'd been wrong, that she'd been exactly who she'd always claimed to be. Someone who cared about truth more than comfort, who couldn't walk away from injustice even when walking away was rational and safe and sensible. He said he understood now why she'd been so guarded, why she'd never fully let him in, because the parts of herself she'd protected weren't weaknesses or flaws. They were her core, her purpose, the thing that made her who she was. Maya read his email 3 times, feeling complicated emotions she couldn't quite name. Vindication, maybe, sadness for what they'd lost, but also acceptance. They'd been wrong for each other ultimately, not because either of them was bad or broken, but because they'd needed different things. He'd needed someone who could be fully present in their shared life. She'd needed someone who could understand that her life would always involve chasing truths that others wanted buried. She wrote back, thanking him for the apology but not suggesting they reconnect. Some relationships ended for good reasons. Some doors, once closed, were meant to stay that way. By summer, the lodge felt less like a place she'd fled to and more like a place she'd chosen. The forest was beautiful when you learned to see it. Not as isolation but as solitude, not as emptiness but as space. She hiked the trails regularly, visited those platforms where subjects had once stood watching their own imprisonment, left small cairns of stones as markers, as memorials, as acknowledgement. She thought often about Catherine Mercer, about the courage it had taken to break 66 years of silence, about the choice Catherine had made, at the very end of her life, to prioritize truth over comfort, justice over security, the needs of people she'd never meet over her own protected status. It was the kind of choice Maya had faced too, in her own way, the kind of choice that defined character, that revealed what you really valued when the easy path and the right path diverged. On the anniversary of publishing the Chrysalis story, Maya stood on the lodge's front porch and looked out at the mountains. She'd come here running from failure, from heartbreak, from a life that had stopped making sense. She'd found something else instead. A mystery that became a mission, a story that needed telling, a purpose that gave her broken life new meaning. The 12 subjects of Project Chrysalis are dead now, all of them. Catherine had been the last, had survived long enough to tell their story, to make sure they weren't forgotten. But their names were part of the historical record now. Their suffering had been acknowledged. The crimes committed against them had been exposed and, in some small way, addressed. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something. It was what Maya had been able to do, what she'd chosen to do, despite the costs, despite the consequences, despite the easier option of staying silent. She went inside and made coffee, settled at her desk, opened her laptop. She had a new story to investigate, whispers of another program, another facility, another set of vulnerable people who'd been promised healing and given something else entirely. If this story moved you, please share it with others and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Stories like these need to be told. The work was never finished. The powerful would always abuse the powerless if no one was watching, if no one was willing to expose their crimes, if no one cared enough to dig through classified files and buried records and decades of official denial. But Maya cared. It was her fatal flaw and her defining strength. The thing that had cost her relationships and careers and the comfortable life she might have built. The thing that had brought her to this mountain, to this lodge, to this purpose she'd never anticipated but now couldn't imagine abandoning. She began to write. The words came easily now, flowing from her fingers onto the screen, building an argument, constructing a narrative, telling a story that powerful people didn't want told. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Inside, Maya did the only thing she'd ever really known how to do. She told the truth. And she didn't stop. Because some people spent their lives building walls. Some people spent their lives tearing them down. Maya had finally figured out which kind of person she was. Had finally become, fully and completely, the person she'd always been meant to be. The kind who couldn't look away. The kind who chose truth over silence, justice over comfort, the hard right over the easy wrong. The kind who knew that changing the world required starting with one story, one truth, one act of courage that inspired others to be brave too. She'd found that courage in Catherine Mercer, in Dr. Elena Cross, in Thomas Brightwell's initials carved into concrete on a mountainside, in 12 people who'd suffered and been forgotten but whose stories had finally, after 66 years, been told. And now Maya would find that courage again in the next story, and the next and the next, because that's what you did when you understood that truth mattered more than comfort. You kept digging, you kept exposing, you kept fighting, even when, especially when, the powerful told you to stop. The cursor blinked. Maya smiled and began to type. The work continued. The truth demanded it, and she would not be silent. Maya spends a sleepless night listening to Catherine Mercer's recorded testimony, confronting the reality of institutional power, the kind that destroys lives and then classifies that destruction as necessary for national security. Sitting in the darkness with her laptop's cursor blinking in a blank document, she faces a defining choice about what kind of reporter and what kind of person she will be. She reflects on Daniel's accusation that he never really knew her, realizing he might have been right. She'd never shown him the parts of herself that mattered most, the parts that chose truth over comfort, that couldn't walk away from injustice even when it was the smart, safe choice. By dawn, Maya makes her decision. Not the easy one, not the safe one, but the only one she can live with. Drawing on her investigative experience, Maya understands that exposing powerful secrets requires more than evidence. It requires strategy, timing, and multiple pressure points that make suppression impossible. She creates a comprehensive package containing Catherine's testimony, Dr. Hendrick's confession letter, laboratory notebook excerpts, personnel files, newspaper articles about the facility's closure and Dr. Cross's suspicious death, and her own investigative report tying everything together. Maya makes multiple copies, both digital and physical. She uploads encrypted files to cloud services, burns DVDs, and prepares packages for journalists who've covered government malfeasance, the ACLU, organization specializing in military accountability, and academic research centers studying medical ethics violations. Most importantly, she prepares a package for Elizabeth Mercer Shaw, insurance that Catherine's testimony will survive regardless of what happens next. By summer, the lodge feels less like a place she fled to and more like a place she chose. The forest is beautiful when you learn to see it, not as isolation but as solitude, not as emptiness but as space. She hikes regularly, visits the platforms where subjects once stood watching their own imprisonment, leaves stone cairns as markers, memorials, and acknowledgement. She thinks often about Catherine Mercer and the courage it took to break 66 years of silence. About the choice Catherine made at the very end of her life to prioritize truth over comfort, justice over security, the needs of people she'd never meet over her own protected status. It was the kind of choice Maya faced too, the kind that defined character, that revealed what you really valued when the easy path and the right path diverged. On the anniversary of publishing the Chrysalis story, Maya stands on the lodge's front porch looking out at the mountains. She'd come here running from failure, heartbreak, and a life that had stopped making sense. She found something else instead. A mystery that became a mission, a story that needed telling, a purpose that gave her broken life new meaning. The 12 subjects of Project Chrysalis are dead now, all of them. Catherine was the last, surviving long enough to tell their story, to make sure they weren't forgotten. But their names are part of the historical record now. Their suffering has been acknowledged. The crimes committed against them have been exposed and, in some small way, addressed. It isn't enough, could never be enough, but it's something. It's what Maya was able to do, what she chose to do despite the costs, consequences, and the easier option of staying silent. She goes inside, makes coffee, settles at her desk, and opens her laptop. She has a new story to investigate, whispers of another program, another facility, another set of vulnerable people promised healing and given something else entirely. The work is never finished. The powerful will always abuse the powerless if no one is watching, if no one is willing to expose their crimes, if no one cares enough to dig through classified files and buried records and decades of official denial. But Maya cares. It's her fatal flaw and her defining strength. The thing that cost her relationships and careers and the comfortable life she might have built. The thing that brought her to this mountain, to this lodge, to this purpose she never anticipated but now can't imagine abandoning. She begins to write. The words come easily now, flowing from her fingers onto the screen, building an argument, constructing a narrative, telling a story that powerful people don't want told. Outside, the wind moves through the pines. Inside, Maya does the only thing she's ever really known how to do. She tells the truth. And she doesn't stop. She'd finally figured out which kind of person she is. Some people spend their lives building walls. Some spend their lives tearing them down. Maya tears them down, relentlessly, without apology, without looking back. The kind who knew that changing the world required starting with one story, one truth, one act of courage that inspired others to be brave too. She found that courage in Catherine Mercer, in Dr. Elena Cross, in Thomas Brightwell's initials carved into concrete on a mountainside, in 12 people who suffered and were forgotten but whose stories were finally, after 66 years, told. And now Maya will find that courage again in the next story, and the next, and the next. Because that's what you do when you understand that truth matters more than comfort. You keep digging. You keep exposing yourself. You keep fighting even when, especially when, the powerful tell you to stop. The cursor blinks. Maya smiles and begins to type. The work continues. The truth demands it. And she will not be silent.